The hydrophone operator aboard U-boat 627 heard it first on the morning of March 14, 1943. A rhythmic thumping sound, distant but distinct, metal striking water somewhere above them in the grey North Atlantic. Kapitän-Leutnant Hans-Joachim Hauser stood in the control room, one hand gripping the periscope housing as the boat maintained its depth at 100 meters. "Destroyer?" he asked quietly. "Jawohl, Herr Kalliun." The operator's voice was steady, professional. "Bearing 045. Range approximately 8,000 meters." Hauser exchanged glances with his executive officer. 8,000 meters, 5 miles. Far enough to be comfortable, close enough to require attention. The Type 7C submarine beneath his feet was one of 700 such boats built for the Kriegsmarine, and Hauser knew her capabilities like he knew his own breathing. At 100 meters, they were invisible. The pressure hull could withstand depths to 230 meters if necessary, though the manufacturer's guarantee ended at 100. In combat, such guarantees meant nothing. "Continue silent running," Hauser ordered. "Maintain depth." The 44 men packed into U-627's narrow steel hull moved with practiced quiet. No unnecessary speech, no dropped tools, no running water. They had drilled this procedure until it became instinct. A submarine's survival depended on invisibility, and invisibility required silence. The destroyer would pass. It always did. The North Atlantic was vast, and a submerged U-boat was a needle in a haystack the size of an ocean. Hauser had made this calculation dozens of times across 4 previous patrols. The mathematics were simple and comforting. British and American depth charges in 1943 had maximum depth settings around 300 feet, roughly 90 meters. At 100 meters depth, U-627 sat comfortably below the effective range of those weapons. Even if the destroyer somehow detected them, even if it attacked, the charges would detonate 30 meters above them, producing nothing more than dull thuds and vibrations. This wasn't arrogance. This was physics. The ocean itself protected them. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Hauser didn't know, what no U-boat commander in the North Atlantic knew in March of 1943, was that the rules had changed. 6 months earlier, the United States Navy had quietly begun modifying its depth charge arsenal. The standard Mark VI and Mark VII weapons that had dominated anti-submarine warfare for the first 3 years of the conflict were being upgraded with new hydrostatic pistols, additional ballast weights, and, most critically, depth settings that reached 600 feet, 183 meters, twice their previous maximum. The modification program was classified. No public announcements, no intelligence leaks. Allied convoy escorts received the improved weapons through regular resupply channels, with technical bulletins explaining the new capabilities in dry, bureaucratic language that belied their revolutionary impact. Set the pistol to 600 feet, drop the charge, wait for the kill. German naval intelligence had no idea this transformation was occurring. Their assessment of Allied depth charge capabilities remained frozen in 1941 estimates, based on captured weapons and pre-war technical data. The Kriegsmarine's tactical doctrine for deep diving was built on a foundation that no longer existed, a comfortable assumption about enemy capabilities that had become catastrophically obsolete, while U-boat commanders continued operating as if nothing had changed. Hans-Joachim Hauser was 31 years old when he took command of U-627 in November of 1942. Born in Hamburg to a family of shipbuilders, he joined the Kriegsmarine in 1934, driven by the same romantic notion that drew so many young Germans to the submarine service. The U-boat arm represented elite status, technical sophistication, and the promise of individual initiative in warfare dominated by mass formations and industrial slaughter. Training at the submarine school in Pillow had stripped away the romanticism and replaced it with technical competence. Hauser learned how pressure hulls worked, how batteries depleted, how diesel engines gulped fuel, how torpedoes tracked, how men lived in spaces barely larger than coffins for weeks at a time. He learned the mathematics of depth and pressure, the formulae that predicted when steel would buckle, when rivets would pop, when the ocean would crush a submarine like an empty can. Most importantly, he learned the tactical doctrines that had made German U-boats the most feared weapon in the Atlantic. Operate at night on the sea. Surface when your silhouette was invisible. Dive before dawn. Stay deep when hunted. Trust your boat's depth capability. The enemy's weapons had limits. Know those limits. Exploit them. By March of 1943, Hauser had completed 4 war patrols and sunk 11 Allied merchant ships totaling 43,000 tons. His crew trusted him. His superiors praised him. The Knight's Cross seemed inevitable if he maintained his performance. Every patrol followed the same pattern. Transit to the operational area, locate a convoy, attack at night, dive deep when escorts counterattacked, slip away when the depth charges stopped exploding, 30 meters above your boat, surface after dark. Repeat. The system worked because U-boat commanders understood the limits of Allied weapons and operated just beyond those limits. It was a game with clear rules, played by both sides, governed by engineering specifications and physical laws that seemed immutable. U-627 had departed. Brest on March 8, 1943, assigned to a patrol area southwest of Iceland, where Allied convoys crossed from Canada to Britain. The boat carried 14 torpedoes, provisions for 8 weeks, and a crew that ranged in age from 17 to 38. The youngest sailor was a mechanic's mate named Kurt Richter, who'd lied about his age to enlist. The oldest was Chief Engineer Wilhelm Meyer, a veteran who'd served on surface ships during the First World War and transitioned to U-boats in 1939. Meyer stood now in the engine room, monitoring gauges that tracked battery charge, compressed air reserves, and trim. Subtle changes in those numbers told him everything about the boat's condition. The batteries were at 72% charge after 6 hours submerged, enough for another 6 hours of silent running if necessary, though they'd need to surface tonight to run the diesel engines and recharge. Compressed air was adequate, trim was perfect, the boat maintaining depth without constant adjustment, which meant Meyer's carefully calculated weight distribution was correct. He'd been doing this job for 4 years, long enough to know that submarine warfare was fundamentally a contest between engineering systems. The boat that could dive deeper, run quieter, stay submerged longer, had tactical advantages that often mattered more than weapons or tactics. German Type 7 boats had been superior to British submarines in diving depth since the war began, a margin of safety that had saved countless crews from depth charge attacks that would have destroyed shallower diving boats. That margin was about to disappear, and Wilhelm Meyer had no way of knowing it. The destroyer's screws grew louder in U-627's hydrophones. Hauser listened to the rhythmic pounding, trying to estimate range and bearing from sound alone. Modern warfare had strange inversions. Submarines were blind predators that hunted by sound, guided by invisible acoustic signatures rather than visual contact. The ocean transmitted noise with peculiar efficiency, carrying the cavitation of propellers for miles, while dampening visual light within meters. Range now 6,000 meters, the hydrophone operator reported. Bearing 0, 4, 3. Course appears steady. Still not a threat. Still just a destroyer passing through the area, probably screening a convoy that was out of detection range. Hauser allowed himself to relax slightly. Another 30 minutes, and the destroyer would be past them. Then they could resume their patrol, searching for merchantmen worth torpedoing. The tactical situation in the North Atlantic had shifted dramatically in the 6 months since Hauser's last patrol. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, had committed nearly 400 operational submarines to the Battle of the Atlantic, concentrating them in wolf packs designed to overwhelm convoy escorts through sheer numbers. The strategy had produced spectacular results in 1942, sinking over 6 million tons of Allied shipping. Month after month, U-boats stalked the convoy routes, and merchant vessels died in flames and explosions that lit the ocean surface like signal flares. But the Allies were adapting faster than German intelligence had anticipated. More escorts, better radar, improved sonar, long-range aircraft that closed the mid-Atlantic air gap where U-boats had previously operated with impunity. The tactical balance was shifting, though Dönitz refused to acknowledge it publicly. His orders to U-boat commanders remained aggressive: find convoys, attack relentlessly, accept casualties as the price of victory. Hauser had read those orders before departing Brest. He understood the strategic imperative. Germany needed to sever Britain's supply lines, starve the island nation into submission before American industrial might could turn the tide. Every merchant ship sunk was food that wouldn't feed British soldiers, fuel that wouldn't power British tanks, ammunition that wouldn't arm British artillery. The mathematics of attrition favoured Germany if U-boats could maintain their kill rate. What the mathematics didn't account for was the technology race happening beneath the surface. The incremental improvements in Allied anti-submarine weapons that were accumulating toward a tipping point that would reverse the equation entirely. "Sir," the hydrophone operator's voice had changed, tension replacing the earlier calm. "The destroyer is turning. New bearing 038. Range now 5,000 meters." Hauser felt his stomach tighten. A course change toward them could be coincidence, but coincidence was dangerous in submarine warfare. "Maintain depth and silence," he ordered. "Prepare to go deeper if necessary." The crew's tension was palpable now. Men at their stations held position with rigid discipline, but their eyes betrayed fear. They'd all experienced depth charge attacks before. The bone-jarring concussions, the terror of waiting in darkness while explosions walked toward you, the relief when the charges finally stopped and you realized you'd survived. It was the psychological warfare that damaged you more than the physical violence, the waiting, the helplessness, the knowledge that your survival depended on factors beyond your control. "Range 4,000 meters, the operator reported. "Bearing 035. Still closing." Not a coincidence. This destroyer had detected something. Maybe a periscope wake from their earlier reconnaissance. Maybe an oil slick from a leaking seal. Maybe radar had caught them during their pre-dawn transit. Whatever the reason, they were being hunted. "Take us to 150 meters, Hauser ordered calmly. "Dead slow on electric motors." The plainsman pushed his controls forward and U-627's bow tilted downward. The depth gauge needle crept clockwise. 110 meters. 120. 130. The pressure hull creaked as water pressure increased, subtle popping sounds as steel compressed. Normal sounds, expected sounds, nothing to worry about. 150 meters. 492 feet, well below the effective depth of Allied depth charges, safe enough to wait out whatever attack was coming. "Level at 150, Hauser commanded. The boat steadied, hanging in the dark water like a mechanical shark, waiting. The destroyer's screws grew thunderous in the hydrophones. Hauser knew the pattern. The escort would pass overhead, drop a pattern of depth charges set for 300 feet, 90 meters, and the charges would explode harmlessly above U-627. Loud, terrifying, but ultimately ineffective. Then the destroyer would lose sonar contact in the turbulence from the explosions and search elsewhere while U-627 crept away at 2 knots. They'd done this before. They'd do it again. The ocean protected submarines that knew how to use depth as a weapon. Depth charges, someone whispered in the control room, a violation of silence protocols that Hauser chose to ignore. The first charges were already falling through the water above them. There was nothing to do now but wait and endure. The explosions began at 8:43 hours on March 14, 1943. The first pattern of 6 charges detonated in rapid succession, the sound waves hammering through U-627's hull like God himself pounding on steel. Light bulbs shattered, instruments flickered, dust and paint chips rained from the overhead, but the boat held. The charges had exploded above them, just as predicted. Hauser checked the depth gauge. Still 150 meters. The boat was intact. No flooding, no catastrophic damage. Just the terrifying noise and vibration of high explosives detonating in water, a violence that submarines were built to withstand as long as the charges exploded far enough away. A second pattern followed. More explosions, more shaking, more terror. But still nothing catastrophic, still survivable. Then came the third pattern, and Hans-Joachim Hauser's understanding of submarine warfare exploded along with the charges. The first explosion was different, closer. Not above them, but alongside, at their depth, a hammer blow that knocked men off their feet and sent equipment crashing. The pressure wave compressed the hull with audible metallic shrieks. Emergency lighting failed. In the sudden darkness, lit only by battery-powered lanterns, Hauser heard screams from the forward torpedo room. A second explosion, even closer. The boat rolled 30 degrees to starboard before recovering. Water began spraying from pipe fittings. The stern plainsman shouted that he'd lost hydraulic pressure. The chief engineer was bellowing damage reports, trying to assess flooding in compartments forward. A third explosion, a fourth, a fifth, each one at depth, each one closer than Allied depth charges should be capable of reaching. Each one shattering the comfortable assumptions that had kept U-boat commanders alive for 4 years of war. In the terrible silence after the last explosion, as the boat wallowed and men worked frantically to control flooding in 3 separate compartments, Hans-Joachim Hauser realized with crystalline clarity that the rules had changed. The ocean no longer protected them. The depth advantage that German U-boats had enjoyed since 1939 had evaporated, and nobody had warned him. "How deep are we?" he asked the plainsman. 155 meters, sir. We're flooding forward. The bow is heavy. 155 meters, 509 feet. And depth charges were exploding at their depth, something that should have been impossible, according to every tactical manual Hauser had ever studied. Wilhelm Meyer fought his way forward through the flooding control room, water already ankle-deep and rising. The emergency lights cast everything in hellish red shadows. Men were shouting damage reports from every compartment, their voices overlapping into incomprehensible noise. Meyer had survived situations like this before, but something felt different this time. The explosions had been too close, too precisely targeted at their actual depth. "Report." Hauser's voice cut through the chaos with parade ground authority. Meyer grabbed a handhold as the boat lurched again. "Forward torpedo room has a cracked seam. Port side. We're taking water, but the pumps are holding for now. The battery compartment ventilation system is damaged. Hydraulics are failing on the forward planes. We've got electrical fires in." Another explosion cut him off. This one was further away, but still at depth. Still hunting them at 150 meters, where no Allied depth charge should be able to reach. "How?" Hauser said quietly, almost to himself. "How are they reaching us this deep?" Nobody had an answer. The question itself violated the fundamental principles they'd operated under for years. German naval intelligence had provided clear specifications on Allied weapons capabilities. Mark VI and Mark VII depth charges, maximum depth setting 300 feet. Type D British charges, maximum depth 300 feet. These weren't estimates or guesses. These were engineering specifications derived from captured weapons and technical analysis. Yet explosions were walking toward them at 500 feet, and the only explanation was that intelligence was wrong. Catastrophically, lethally wrong. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. "Take us deeper," Hauser ordered. 200 meters. The plainsman hesitated for just a moment. 200 meters was beyond the boat's operational depth, pushing into the zone where the pressure hull's integrity became questionable. But staying at 150 meant certain death if those depth charges kept finding them. "Jawohl, Herr Kaleun," U-627's bow tilted downward again. The depth gauge needle crept past 160, 170. The creaking and popping sounds from the pressure hull intensified. These weren't normal sounds anymore. These were warnings, the steel itself protesting the water pressure crushing it from all sides. 180 meters, 590 feet. Deeper than Hauser had ever taken the boat. Deeper than most commanders would dare. "Level at 200, Hauser commanded, his voice betraying no hint of the fear churning in his gut. The boat steadied at 656 feet. The pressure hull groaned continuously now, a low metallic moan that every man aboard could hear and feel. Rivets were stressed to their limits. Welds were being tested beyond their design parameters. Wilhelm Meyer watched his gauges with the intensity of a man reading his own death warrant, waiting for the indicators that would tell him the hull was beginning to fail. If the Allies had depth charges that could reach 150 meters, could they reach 200? The question hung in the air, unspoken but understood by every man in the control room. They were fleeing into deeper water, gambling that they'd found safety, but with no certainty that such safety existed anymore. The destroyer's screws passed directly overhead. The sound was deafening even through the hull, a mechanical thunder that seemed to shake the boat with vibrations alone. Then came the splashes, the characteristic sound of depth charges hitting the water. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. An entire pattern launched directly above them. The waiting was worse than the explosions. Hauser counted seconds, calculating how long it would take the charges to sink to their preset depths. Standard charges fell at 8 feet per second. From the surface to 150 meters would take approximately 60 seconds. But these weren't standard charges, were they? Intelligence had been wrong about the depth settings. What else had intelligence been wrong about? The first explosion came at 45 seconds, closer than the last pattern, a hammer blow that threw men against bulkheads and ruptured another seam in the forward torpedo room. Kurt Richter, the 17-year-old who'd lied about his age, was screaming in the darkness. Someone in the aft compartment was praying loudly in Bavarian dialect. The second explosion hit at 48 seconds. The lights failed completely. In absolute darkness, lit only by emergency lanterns that cast dancing shadows, U-627 bucked like a wounded animal. The third explosion, at 50 seconds, was the closest yet. The pressure wave compressed the hull with a sound like a gunshot amplified 1,000 times. Instruments shattered, the depth gauge glass cracked, water began spraying from a dozen new leaks. But then came something Hauser hadn't expected. Silence. The remaining 3 charges detonated somewhere above them, muffled thumps that indicated the explosions were at least 50 meters away, too far to cause critical damage. The Allies had set their pattern with charges at varying depths, some reaching 600 feet, but not all of them. Not yet. Damage report. Hauser ordered into the darkness. The reports came in piecemeal, shouted through the narrow passages that connected compartments. Forward torpedo room flooding worse but contained. Battery compartment secure but ventilation still offline, which meant hydrogen gas from the batteries would start accumulating soon. Electric motors functioning. Diesel engines undamaged but useless while submerged. Hull integrity holding at 200 meters, but Meyer's voice carried a warning when he reported it. They couldn't stay this deep indefinitely. The pressure was already causing microfractures in welds that would worsen with every passing minute. Hauser stood in the red-lit darkness, doing calculations that a month ago he'd never have considered necessary. If Allied depth charges could now reach 600 feet, every tactical doctrine the Kriegsmarine had developed for deep diving was obsolete. The safe zones below 300 feet that U-boat commanders had relied on for 4 years had become kill zones. The ocean no longer protected submarines that dived deep, it had become complicit in their destruction. The strategic implications were staggering. Hundreds of U-boats operated in the Atlantic based on assumptions that were suddenly false. Hundreds of commanders were making tactical decisions, believing they had depth advantages that no longer existed. How many boats had already been lost because commanders dived to safe depths that weren't safe anymore? How many more would die before the Kriegsmarine adapted its tactics? Sir. The hydrophone operator's voice was barely above a whisper. The destroyer is moving away. Range increasing. Hauser checked his watch. They'd been submerged for 9 hours, running on batteries that were now below 40% charge. They needed to surface tonight to recharge, but the destroyer might be waiting, hoping they'd do exactly that. The hunter-killer tactics Allied escorts had developed were sophisticated, patient, willing to wait hours for a U-boat to make a mistake. Maintain depth and silence, Hauser ordered. We wait until dark. The waiting was its own form of torture. Trapped at 200 meters in a steel tube that groaned and leaked, breathing air that grew increasingly foul as carbon dioxide accumulated, knowing that every minute at this depth stressed the hull closer to failure. Men sat at their stations in silence, conserving oxygen, conserving energy, conserving hope. Wilhelm Meyer made his rounds through the boat, checking systems, offering quiet encouragement to crew members who looked like they might break. He'd been doing this job long, enough to recognize the signs of psychological collapse. The youngest men were most vulnerable, but even veterans sometimes reached a breaking point where the accumulated stress of patrol after patrol finally exceeded their capacity to endure. In the forward torpedo room, Kurt Richter sat with his back against a bulkhead, crying silently in the darkness. He'd been struck in the face by a piece of shattered gauge glass during the attack, and blood had dried in a dark crust down his cheek. Meyer sat beside him, not speaking, just presence. Sometimes that was enough. Chief, Richter whispered, are we going to die? Meyer considered the question carefully. Lying to the boy wouldn't help, but neither would complete honesty. Not today, he finally said. Not if we're smart and lucky. How did they find us that deep? I thought we were safe at 150 meters. So did I, Meyer admitted. So did everyone. But the war changes faster than our knowledge of it. The Allies have improved their weapons, and we didn't know about it soon enough. Will Command tell the other boats? Will they know not to trust the depth anymore? It was a good question, the kind of question that revealed intelligence beneath the boyish fear. If we survive to make our report, Meyer said. Yes, Command will warn every U-boat in the Atlantic, but that's only if we survive. At 1600 hours, Hauser ordered the boat up to 100 meters to reduce the stress on the hull. At 1800 hours, with battery charge below 20% and the air in the boat thick and stale, he made the decision to surface. Battle stations surface, he commanded. Gun crew prepare to man deck gun. Be ready to dive immediately if the destroyer is waiting for us. The boat began its ascent. 50 meters. 30 meters. 20. The periscope broke the surface, and Hauser made a rapid sweep of the horizon. Twilight was settling over the North Atlantic, the sky overcast and dark, no ships visible, no aircraft. The destroyer was either gone or lurking just beyond visual range. Surface, Hauser ordered. U-627 broke through into open air like a whale breaching. Hatches cracked open and fresh air rushed into the fetid interior, a benediction that made men gasp with relief. The diesel engines roared to life, their healthy mechanical thunder more beautiful than any symphony. Hauser climbed through the conning tower hatch onto the bridge, scanning the horizon through binoculars while sea spray soaked his face, empty ocean in all directions. They'd survived, but the cost was visible in the damage littering the deck and the exhaustion carved into his crew's faces. The gun crew emerged to man the deck gun, moving with mechanical efficiency despite their exhaustion. Standard procedure when surfacing in enemy waters. If aircraft attacked before they could dive, the gun was their only defense. Wilhelm Meyer appeared, on the bridge, his face gaunt in the twilight. Battery charge will take 8 hours minimum, he reported. We have significant flooding in 3 compartments that will require surface time to repair properly. The forward planes are only responding at 50%. We've lost 1 external torpedo container due to pressure damage. And Herr Carleon, with respect, we need to discuss something. Speak freely, Chief. The boat went deeper than her design depth today. We held, but there will be microfractures in welds and stress points throughout the hull. Some of those fractures will propagate with continued diving. This boat needs yard time for a complete pressure hull inspection, or we risk catastrophic failure on a future dive. Hauser nodded slowly. He'd known this conversation was coming. Your professional opinion, Chief. Can this boat complete our assigned patrol? Meyer was quiet for a long moment, weighing duty against honest assessment. If we avoid depths below 100 meters, probably. If we're forced deep again by another attack, possibly not. The hull will hold until it doesn't, and when it fails, it will fail catastrophically. There won't be warning. Understood. Your assessment will be noted in my patrol report. The 2 men stood in silence, watching the sun sink below the western horizon. Around them, the crew worked to make repairs, their movements slow and mechanical. Everyone aboard understood they'd survived something significant today, a turning point where the assumptions that had kept them alive suddenly failed. Sir, Meyer said quietly, if Allied depth charges can now reach 600 feet or deeper, every U-boat in the Atlantic is operating under false assumptions. How many boats have we lost in the past months because commanders thought they were safe at depth when they weren't? I don't know, Chief. But when we return to Brest, I'll make sure Command understands the situation completely. Other crews need to know before they die, from the same mistake we almost made. Through the night, U-627 ran on the surface, diesel engines charging batteries and providing power for emergency repairs. The crew worked in shifts, some sleeping while others welded leaking seams and replaced damaged equipment. The forward torpedo room flooding was contained but not stopped, requiring constant pump operation. The hydraulic system for the forward planes was jury-rigged back to partial function. The cracked depth gauge was replaced with a spare. By 0300 hours on March 15th, the boat was marginally functional again, though Wilhelm Meyer's assessment remained unchanged. The hull had been stressed beyond design limits, and continued operations at depth would eventually cause catastrophic failure. The question wasn't if, but when. Hauser stood on the bridge in darkness, making calculations that had no good answers. His assigned patrol area was another 2,000 nautical miles away. Getting there required running submerged during daylight to avoid aircraft detection, which meant diving to at least 60 meters, stressing the already damaged hull. And once in the patrol area, they'd need to attack convoys, which meant exposure to depth charge attacks from escorts, who apparently had weapons far more capable than German intelligence believed. The tactical situation had fundamentally changed, and the Kriegsmarine didn't know it yet. U-boat commanders throughout the Atlantic were making decisions based on obsolete information about Allied capabilities. They were diving to depths they believed were safe, conducting attacks they believed were survivable, trusting engineering specifications that were 6 months out of date. How many boats were dying because nobody had told them the rules had changed? The question haunted Hauser through the pre-dawn darkness. He thought about the other commanders he'd trained with at Pillow, men who'd become friends during the years of war. How many of them were still alive? How many had already died, perhaps in attacks where they dived to safe depths that turned out to be kill zones? The statistics were grim and getting worse. In the first 3 months of 1943, the Kriegsmarine had lost 81 U-boats. Crews were calling it Black May, even though May was still 2 months away, because everyone understood that Allied anti-submarine capabilities were improving faster than German countermeasures could adapt. New radar, better sonar, more escorts, long-range aircraft, improved tactics, and now, apparently, depth charges that could reach depths U-boat commanders thought were safe. The technological race was turning against Germany, and the U-boat arm was paying the price in steel and blood. At 05:30, with dawn approaching and battery charge restored to 60%, Hauser ordered the dive. U-627 slipped beneath the waves with mechanical efficiency, her crew moving through the procedure, with practiced competence despite their exhaustion. They dived to 60 meters for the daylight transit, shallow enough to minimize stress on the damaged hull, deep enough to avoid visual detection from aircraft. The depth gauge needle crept clockwise as the boat descended. 20 meters, 30, 40. The pressure hull began its characteristic creaking as water pressure increased. Normal sounds. Expected sounds. But after yesterday's attack, every sound made Hauser's stomach tighten, wondering if this would be the moment when a stressed weld finally failed and the ocean rushed in with crushing force. 50 meters, 60. The plainsman leveled the boat with practiced precision. The hull held. For now, level at 60 meters, Hauser confirmed. Ahead slow, course 090. The boat settled into the routine of submerged transit. Men who weren't on watch tried to sleep, though sleep came hard after yesterday's terror. Those on duty monitored instruments and hydrophones, listening for threats in the acoustic landscape of the Atlantic. The ocean was never truly silent. Whale song, distant ship screws, the subtle sounds of current and temperature layers interacting with the hull. A competent hydrophone operator could hear all of it and distinguish genuine threats from background noise. 3 days later, on March 18th, U-627 encountered convoy HX-2 2940 merchantmen with 8 escorts steaming northeast toward Britain. Hauser spent 6 hours stalking them from maximum range, studying their formation and trying to identify the weakest point in their defences. The old tactics would have been simple. Surface at night, race into the convoy formation at 20 knots, fire torpedoes at point-blank range, dive before the escorts could respond. But Hauser's confidence was shattered. The depth advantage he'd relied on for 4 years was gone. If he attacked this convoy and escorts counterattacked, diving deep wouldn't save him. The 600-foot charges he'd experienced 3 days ago would find U-627 wherever she went, and the damaged hull might not survive another attack like that. For the first time in his career, Hans-Joachim Hauser chose not to attack a vulnerable target. He ordered the boat to break off, fade into the depths, let the convoy pass untouched. It felt like cowardice, like failure, like betrayal of every principle the U-boat service represented. But it was also survival, the recognition that tactical doctrines built on obsolete intelligence were recipes for suicide. The decision haunted him for the remaining 5 weeks of the patrol. They encountered 2 more convoys and broke off both times without attacking. They sank 1 lone merchant ship, a straggler separated from its convoy by engine trouble, but even that attack felt hollow. U-627 had gone from hunter to something more cautious, a predator that suddenly recognized it was also prey. On April 22nd, 1943, U-627 returned to Brest. The boat limped into port with battle flags flying for 1 confirmed kill, a pathetic showing compared to Hauser's previous patrols. He expected reprimands, possibly relief of command. Instead, what awaited him was even worse. Confirmation that his experience wasn't unique. Part 3. The Cost of Truth. The operations officer at Brest Submarine headquarters was a Korvettenkapitän named Dietrich Mann, a staff officer who'd never commanded a boat at sea but understood tactics and logistics with bureaucratic precision. He listened to Hauser's report about the depth charge attack with an expression that combined disbelief and resignation. 600 feet, Mann repeated. You're certain? The charges were exploding at our depth, Herr Korvettenkapitän. We were at 150 meters when they found us. We went to 200 meters, and they were still reaching us, though not as precisely. The only explanation is that Allied depth charges now have significantly greater depth capabilities than our intelligence assessments indicate. Mann opened a folder on his desk and extracted several documents. You're the 7th commander to file similar reports in the past 6 weeks. U-406 reported depth charges at 160 meters in February. U-535 reported explosions at 170 meters in early March. Intelligence dismissed those reports as misidentification or errors in depth gauge readings. It's not an error, Hauser said flatly. Allied weapons capabilities have improved, and we're operating under obsolete intelligence. Every U-boat in the Atlantic is at risk. Your report will be forwarded to Admiral Dönitz's headquarters with my strongest recommendation that all boats be warned immediately. Mann's tone suggested he didn't expect his recommendation to be followed. Quickly, the Kriegsmarine had a bureaucratic inertia that could be deadly. In the meantime, U-627 is assigned to dockyard for repairs. The pressure hull damage you described requires complete inspection and probably replate of several sections. You and your crew are reassigned to shore duty for a minimum of 8 weeks. 8 weeks. Hauser felt simultaneous relief and guilt. Relief that he wouldn't have to take the damaged boat back to sea. Guilt that other crews would still be out there, operating under false assumptions about their safety margins. Permission to speak freely, sir? Granted. If we don't warn every boat immediately, if we don't update our tactical doctrines to account for improved Allied depth charges, we're going to lose submarines and crews that could have survived with better information. This isn't about intelligence estimates or bureaucratic procedures. This is about keeping our men alive. Mann looked tired, suddenly, the exhaustion of a staff officer who understood the stakes but lacked authority to change things, quickly. I agree with you, Korvettenkapitän Hauser. Unfortunately, changing Kriegsmarine doctrine requires evidence that convinces people who haven't experienced what you experienced. Your report will help build that evidence. But bureaucracy moves slowly, even in wartime. The conversation haunted Hauser for weeks afterward. How many U-boats were lost while bureaucracy moved slowly? How many crews died at depths they thought were safe, never understanding that the rules had changed until the moment the ocean crushed them? The statistics that emerged over the following months told a brutal story. May 1943 became known as Black May, when 43 U-boats were lost in a single month, the highest monthly casualties the U-boat arm had ever suffered. Admiral Dönitz finally withdrew the wolf packs from the North Atlantic on May 24th, admitting defeat in a campaign that had come close to strangling Britain's supply lines. The reasons for the defeat were complex and interconnected. Improved Allied radar that could detect surfaced U-boats in darkness. More sophisticated sonar that could track submerged boats from greater ranges, long-range aircraft that closed the mid-Atlantic air gap, better tactics, more escorts, improved weapons, and yes, depth charges that could reach 600 feet, eliminating the depth sanctuary that German U-boats had relied on since the war began. Kriegsmarine intelligence eventually captured an intact Mark VII depth charge from a sunken Allied vessel in June 1943. Technical examination confirmed what Hauser and other commanders had reported. The Allies had modified their weapons with new hydrostatic pistols that could be set to 600 feet, later models reaching 1,000 feet, 300 meters, deeper than any U-boat could safely operate. The captured charge was disassembled in a laboratory in Kiel, its components examined by engineers who had designed Germany's own depth charges. The hydrostatic pistol that controlled detonation depth was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering, a pressure-activated mechanism that could be precisely calibrated for any depth setting. The ballast weights attached to increase sinking rate were simple but effective, adding 40 pounds of lead that changed the weapon's descent profile from 8 feet per second to 12. The modifications weren't revolutionary. They were evolutionary improvements to existing weapons, exactly the kind of incremental upgrades that intelligence organizations should have detected months earlier through prisoner interrogations, technical surveillance, or signals intercept. But German naval intelligence had failed to identify the changes until U-boat crews discovered them through bitter experience. The failure cost lives. Post-war analysis suggested that between December 1942 and May 1943, approximately 20 U-boats were lost to depth charge attacks that exploited the improved weapon capabilities. 20 boats, over 900 men dead, all because intelligence assessments were 6 months out of date and tactical doctrines weren't updated in time. Hans-Joachim Hauser never went to sea again. After his 8 weeks of shore leave, he was assigned as an instructor at the submarine school in Pilot, teaching the next generation of U-boat commanders about tactics and survival. He lectured about the importance of questioning intelligence assessments, about staying updated on Allied capabilities, about never assuming that advantages you enjoyed yesterday would exist tomorrow. The Knight's Cross he'd expected after 4 successful patrols never came. His 5th patrol, with only 1 ship sunk and 2 convoy attacks aborted, was considered a failure by commanders who didn't understand that Hauser's caution had saved his boat and crew from destruction. The Kriegsmarine still rewarded aggression over survival in spring 1943, though that would change as casualties mounted and experienced commanders became too valuable to waste. Wilhelm Meyer survived the war. After U-627 completed repairs in July 1943, he was assigned to a new boat, U-341, where he served as chief engineer through 3 more patrols before the boat was sunk in February 1944. Meyer was one of 9 survivors picked up by an Allied destroyer, spending the rest of the war in a prisoner camp in Canada. He returned to Germany in 1947 and worked as a civilian marine engineer until his retirement in 1973. Kurt Richter, the 17-year-old who'd cried in the torpedo room, didn't survive. He was killed in May 1943 during a depth charge attack on U-496 when the pressure hull failed at 180 meters. The boat imploded with all hands lost. Richter's mother received notification of his death in June, learning only then that her son had lied about his age to enlist and died at 17 years old in an iron coffin at the bottom of the Atlantic. The broader strategic picture was clear by the end of 1943. Germany had lost the Battle of the Atlantic. U-boats continued operating through 1944 and into 1945, sinking ships and killing sailors. But the campaign's strategic objective, strangling Britain's supply lines and forcing surrender, was no longer achievable. Allied merchant ship production exceeded U-boat sinking rates. Allied anti-submarine capabilities improved faster than German countermeasures could adapt. The technological and industrial advantage had shifted decisively against Germany. The improved depth charges were one piece of that larger puzzle. Individually, the modification that allowed 600-foot detonation depths wasn't decisive. But combined with better radar, improved sonar, long-range aircraft, more escorts, refined tactics, and code breaking that revealed U-boat positions, the depth charge improvements contributed to an accumulating tactical superiority that German submariners couldn't overcome. Post-war interviews with Allied naval officers revealed that the depth charge modifications had been implemented precisely because intelligence assessments suggested German U-boats were exploiting depth advantages. Allied weapons designers understood that German submarines could dive to 200 meters or deeper, and they deliberately engineered their weapons to reach those depths. It was a technological arms race, and the side with greater industrial capacity and faster innovation cycles won. The irony was that German U-boat commanders had created their own vulnerability. By consistently diving deep to evade attacks, they demonstrated their capability to Allied intelligence. The Allies responded by developing weapons that could reach those depths. The tactical advantage became a strategic liability, exploited, by an enemy with the resources to adapt faster than German forces could counter-adapt. Today, U-627's wreck lies somewhere in the North Atlantic, sunk in June 1944, with all hands lost during her 8th war patrol under a different commander. The boat that survived Hans-Joachim Hauser's discovery of Allied depth charge improvements eventually fell victim to those same weapons when her new commander, lacking Hauser's cautious experience, attempted an aggressive attack on a heavily defended convoy. The story of how German submariners discovered that Allied depth charges could now detonate at 600 feet is ultimately a story about information warfare and technological adaptation. Intelligence failures killed U-boat crews before any torpedo or depth charge did. The assumption that yesterday's knowledge remained valid tomorrow cost lives. The bureaucratic delays in updating tactical doctrines based on field reports from combat commanders turned survivable situations into death traps. For the men who served aboard German U-boats in 1943, the lesson was brutal and immediate. The ocean was no longer their ally. The depth that had once protected them had become just another zone where Allied weapons could reach them. The psychological shift from hunter to hunted, from confidence to fear, from aggression to caution, marked a turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic that would never be reversed. Hans-Joachim Hauser died in 1978 at age 66, having spent 35 years after the war working as a maritime insurance underwriter in Hamburg. He rarely spoke about his wartime service, though he maintained correspondence with several crew members from U-627 until his death. In his personal papers, discovered after his death by his daughter, was a letter he'd written but never sent to Admiral Dönitz in May 1943. The letter detailed his depth charge experience and urged immediate warning to all U-boat commanders about Allied weapon improvements. The letter was stamped, filed without action by headquarters staff, and returned to Hauser months later. Sometimes the truth arrives too late to save the people who need it most. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.